Good afternoon, and welcome to today's presentation on the Global Status of CCS for 2014. My name is Clare Penrose, and I'm the General Manager for the Asia Pacific region for the Global CCS Institute, and I'll be giving today's presentation. Joining me for the question and answer session at the end of the presentation will be a panel of our expert advisors here at the Global CCS Institute, including Chris Consoli on CO2 storage, Ian Havercroft on CCS laws and regulations, Lawrence Earlham on CCS policy and economics, Jessica Morton on CCS public engagement and public awareness, and Tony Zhang on CO2 capture technologies. We're going to start the presentation shortly, but throughout the presentation you will be able to send in your questions. There should be a box on your screen where you can type questions in English, and when we finish the presentation I'll be posing these questions to our panel of experts to answer. So feel free to send your questions in during the presentation or to wait to the very end as well. If we don't get a chance to get through all of your questions today, we will do our best to follow up with you at a later time. So today's presentation is on the global status of CCS for 2014. In particular, I'll be hoping to draw your attention to some of the developments in the Asia Pacific region. Each year, the Global CCS Institute releases the Status of CCS report. This year's report provides, as they have in the past, a comprehensive overview of the global and regional developments in large-scale CCS projects, CCS technologies, and the policy, legal and regulatory environment. This year's report also has something a little bit different, where we've introduced and are including descriptions for 40 notable CCS projects around the world. In the Institute, we define a large-scale CCS project as one that has the capacity to capture at least 400,000 tonnes of CO2 per year in the industrial sector. And in the coal-fired power generation sector, a large-scale project is one that has the capacity to capture at least 800,000 tonnes of CO2 each year. So that's generally been the focus of our reports to date, but we've recognised that there are a large and increasing number of slightly smaller projects that are still notable for the lessons they're learning and the contributions they're making for the development of CCS globally. And so that's why this year's report includes and focuses on some of these notable projects. We've also included some recommendations for decision makers, as well as along with our insights. The full report is available online on our website and includes supporting resources and data. And I encourage you all to follow up on our website if you haven't done already. So we know that fossil fuels play a significant role in the supply of energy globally. Fossil fuels also make a significant contribution to the greenhouse gas emissions that are driving anthropogenic climate change. You can see from the chart in front of you there that between 1990 and 2010, whilst there's been significant investment in renewable and nuclear energy, the relative proportions of energy being supplied by fossil fuels has remained the same. Looking into the future, into 2035, the IEA predicts that that share will not alter much. There'll be a small increase in renewable energy's contribution, but fossil fuels will continue to be the dominant supplier of energy around the world. So this means we need to find a way to address the emissions that come from fossil fuels when we generate energy. The IEA shows that CCS can play a vital part in addressing the emissions from the energy sector. The chart on your screen illustrates the potential sources of emissions reductions that could come over the period to 2050. You can see there that if we want to shift from a 2 degrees scenario down to a 6 degrees scenario down to a 2 degrees scenario, that there are 6 potential technological solutions. Of those, CCS could contribute up to 14% of the emissions reductions over the period 2011 to 2050. And that's a substantial contribution. That role, the critical role of CCS is increasingly being recognised by expert bodies around the world. You can see there that in the most recent report released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, that they too have recognised the role that CCS can play in contributing to our goals of limiting greenhouse gas emissions. In the report released last week, they are quoted as saying, many of the models which are looking at our options for limiting greenhouse gas emissions could not achieve the atmospheric concentration levels of 450 parts per million by 2100 if CCS was excluded. You can also see there that the Energy Modelling Forum, the International Energy Agency, amongst others, are echoing the importance of CCS contributing to our global efforts on climate change. Just on the IPCC report that came out last week, interestingly, you can see here on the screen that they examined 11 models looking at future scenarios for cutting emissions. When they were looking at the models that excluded CCS as one of the technology options to address climate change, that only 4 of the models were able to achieve a 450 parts per million scenario by 2100 without CCS. That's 4 out of 11. But not only that, the cost of achieving a 450 parts per million scenario was on average 138% higher if CCS was excluded. This chart here also shows you the additional costs that would be involved if you were to limit some of the other technological solutions. And you can see there that costs are increased under each of these scenarios if we phase out nuclear, limit solar and wind, or limit bioenergy. But the cost increases are nowhere as great as the scenarios where we exclude CCS. So I think this tells us that CCS has an important role to play in ensuring that we can address climate change in a cost-effective and efficient manner. So where are we up to with deploying CCS around the world? Well, this is what we've demonstrated in the Global Status of CCS report this year. So when we look at where are the large-scale CCS projects around the world by region or country, we can see that the most number of projects are occurring in North America, with 26 projects either in planning, construction or operation in the North America region. This is almost 50% of the total number of large-scale projects under consideration or operating around the world. You can see there that there are 9 under operation, and I think the exciting element of this development this year is that the first large-scale CCS project in the power sector, that's the Boundary Dam project in Saskatchewan in Canada, commenced operation in September. So amongst these numbers of projects, we have a pretty critical threshold project that has commenced operation with Boundary Dam. Leading the charge behind North America is China. And we've seen significant progress here. 3 years ago, we didn't really even have projects listed in China, and now China is the second most prevalent region in the world. They're yet to have a large-scale project under construction or operation, but we anticipate that possibly 2 of those projects in the advanced planning stage may take a final investment decision over the coming year. The next region with the most number of projects is Europe. And I think this is where we've seen the most substantial change in recent years in the opposite direction. We had a larger number of projects under consideration in Europe, but due to a number of factors, we haven't seen those projects progressing through to the construction or operation. I think one of the standouts in Europe at the moment is the United Kingdom, where we are seeing 2 projects in particular, the White Rose and Peterhead projects, receiving significant support and funding and progressing through to the front-end engineering design phase. After this, we have the Gulf Cooperation Council. And one of the reasons the Institute this year has focused on the Gulf region is because of the 2 projects that are under construction there at the moment. One of those is particularly significant from a global perspective. That's the Abu Dhabi CCS project at the Emirates Steel Initiative. And this project will be the world's first large-scale project in the steel sector. It's currently under construction and expects to commence operation in 2016. And in the rest of the world there, you can see we've got another 7 large-scale projects under consideration. The one under construction there that you can see will be the world's largest geological storage project, and that's the Gorgon. We also have projects there in Korea that are under consideration in the early planning stages. So this brings it to a total of 55 large-scale CCS projects around the world in the planning, operation or construction phases. Next, I'd like to run you through some different features of the projects and different themes that we see emerging in the portfolio of CCS projects being considered around the world. If you look at all of the existing projects that are operating, you can see that there is a definite focus of projects in the natural gas processing sector. The reason being is that CO2 separation occurs as part of the production here, so it's not surprising that we've seen some of the first large-scale projects come on board in this sector. But we know that because such a large proportion of the world's global greenhouse gas emissions come from the power generation sector, that it's important that we start to see more projects emerging there. And that's why that Boundary Dam project up there that I've mentioned commenced operation in September is so significant, because it's the world's first large-scale project in the power sector. The other theme that you can see quite strongly in the existing projects that are operating around the world is the type of storage or the use of the CO2 that's occurring. The majority of the projects there are using the captured CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. There are 3 projects, 2 in Norway, Sleipner and Snøhvit, that are using the CO2 for dedicated geological storage, as well as the Insular project in Algeria. Boundary Dam is also using a small proportion of the captured CO2, which is about 1 million tonnes per year. They are using a small amount of that for research into dedicated geological storage. So I think what we acknowledge and recognise here is that EOR is playing an important role in the early days of these large-scale projects, but that we do need to see a shift in time towards more projects that are undertaking dedicated geological storage. So if we look now at the projects that are under construction, you can see that diversity starting to occur. There are more projects occurring in new sectors, and there are more projects with significant amounts of dedicated geological storage. Just draw your attention to a couple of the projects that you can see on the screen now. Firstly, the Petronova and the Kemper projects, both under construction in the United States and both CCS projects in the power sector. So again, this is proving up that we can demonstrate CCS in the power sector effectively. Petronova is similar to Boundary Dam in that it will be a post-combustion capture project, whereas Kemper County will be a pre-combustion capture project, and it's using new IGCC technology. So there we're seeing a demonstration of 2 different technologies at large scale in the power sector. I think the Illinois Industrial Project is also going to be an important project because it's demonstrating, firstly, application of CCS at large scale in chemical production, as well as undertaking dedicated geological storage. And you can also see there the Quest project in Canada and the Gorgon project in Australia, which will be sequestering significant amounts of CO2 for dedicated geological storage. But if we look beyond the projects that are currently under construction, you can see that the projects in the planning pipeline are increasingly showing a trend towards more in the power generation sector. There is also an increasing trend towards more large-scale projects undertaking dedicated geological storage. So 2014 and 15 are watershed years for CCS. We've seen the first large-scale CCS project in the power sector commence operation and hope to see another 2 shortly follow. And I think that the progress that we're seeing in these large-scale CCS projects reflects the policy and other decisions that have been made in the past 5 years, and they've helped drive this progress that we're seeing. There is a risk, though, that if we don't continue the efforts, we won't see those projects in the advanced planning pipeline that I showed before coming to fruition and commencing operation. So there is a need to make sure that we have the policies in place, the support, the incentives and the continued investment to make sure that those projects that are in the planning pipeline come through to construction and operation. But post 2020, again, we're going to need to see more action because we need to have more projects around the world if we're going to see the widespread deployment of CCS that we need for it to play that contribution to tackling global greenhouse gas emissions and making the contributions that the IEA and others are estimating that it will make. So now I thought I'd just go through a very brief overview of the regional highlights of CCS. Just firstly, quickly in North America. As I flagged, well over half of the large-scale projects in operation or under construction are occurring in the United States and Canada. Also, the world's first 3 large-scale CCS power projects are happening in this region. It is true that CO2 enhanced oil recovery, or EOR, is providing the significant business case and driving the construction and development of those projects. This isn't an option in some other regions in the world, but it is certainly a very key driver for the CCS projects that we're seeing in the North America region. But in addition to the opportunities for enhanced oil recovery, we have got significant policy and incentives occurring in this region that are driving CCS deployment. The US DOE is pivotal in that, providing significant funding for R&D, as well as, I think, promoting a very strong and positive message for the deployment of CCS in the United States. Brazil and Mexico as well should not be forgotten because they also are investing time, effort and expertise into developing up the potential for CCS in their countries. In the Asia Pacific region, we know from the earlier slide that China follows the US as the most active country in CCS and CCUS. The Asia Pacific region also has the significant point that the world's largest dedicated geological storage project, Gorgon, is under construction and expecting to commence injection in 2016. That project will have the potential to sequester up to 3 million tonnes of CO2 each year. Outside China and Australia, though, we are seeing significant activities in Japan and Korea. Japan has a number of pilot and notable CCS projects, including the Osaki Coolgen project and the Tomokamai project in the north of the country that are under construction and will play a significant role in demonstrating CCS technology as well as the integrated CCS projects in Japan. Korea, led by KEPCO, is also at the advanced stages of testing capture technology and has 2 large-scale CCS projects under consideration. I think a key focus in the near term across the Asia Pacific region is developing and advancing our knowledge of the storage potential, and that's across all of the countries in the region. There have been efforts, particularly in the pre-commercial space in Australia and other countries, but we know that if we're going to see more widespread deployment of CCS across the region, that we need greater knowledge, understanding of the storage potential available. I think another message that came out of our status report this year is a need to increase the legal and regulatory and policy settings in our region to make sure that project proponents have the certainty, the guidelines to enable them to make those investment decisions and deploy more large-scale CCS projects. In Europe, as I flagged, the CCS ambition that we saw some years ago has not come to fruition. I think that most people would recognise that the economic circumstances have been a key driver of that in the Europe region. But I think a positive sign most recently was the announcement of the European Council's increased target for cutting greenhouse gas emissions, as well as its continued support for the NER program. As flagged, the UK has been putting in place some significant policy developments and programs that includes the Contract for Difference program, as well as its £1 billion CCS commercialisation competition. The White Rose, which is an oxyfuel CCS project, and the Peterhead project, again, that'll be a CCS gas-fired power station project. Both of those are benefiting under those projects, those policies at the moment, and giving them the best chance to progress from a planning through to a realised project. So the UK really has been leading the way with policy and program support for large-scale CCS projects in this region. I think the other project just to flag in the Europe region is the Dutch Road Project. This is a critical project providing infrastructure and a hub for emissions across Europe. And they're still obviously in the planning phases and looking and reaching out for partners in that project. Moving on now from a regional focus to talk about some of the technology aspects and where we're at, what the status is of the different components of the CCS infrastructure chain. And the first is CO2 capture. We know how to capture CO2. We've known how to do that for many decades through the natural gas and other sectors. What we need to focus on is reducing the costs and improving the application of the CO2 capture technologies that are out there. The first of a kind projects that we're seeing, such as Boundary Dam, are going to deliver important lessons for us on which capture technologies are appropriate in which circumstances and how can we improve the efficiency and reduce the costs. That's why continued R&D on all aspects of materials, processes and equipment is essential. I think it's also important that we see collaboration globally to make sure that we can share the learnings and knowledge. In CO2 storage, the focus has to be on progressing our knowledge and understanding now. EOR is currently providing support to the large-scale projects, well, most of them, that are currently being deployed. But we know that if we're going to see projects globally across all regions, that we need to increase our knowledge and understanding of sites for dedicated geological storage. New sites can take up to 10 years to assess and be ready to be included in a final investment decision. So we can't wait. We can't wait until we're several years down the track before we start this important process. We need to make sure that governments are playing a role in pre-competitive assessments, and we need to provide incentives for industry to also be undertaking storage exploration and providing us with the knowledge and data so that we can, in years to come, where it is appropriate, take those final investment decisions to have projects in the right place. Policy and clear regulatory regimes are essential, though, to give both project proponents confidence to make these large investments, but also to put in place an incentive for projects to be developed. We've already highlighted that achieving our climate goals will be far more costly without CCS. But we still are at a first-of-a-kind demonstration in many sectors. So that's why it's important that we continue to see substantial public funding programs continuing to help support the deployment and demonstration of large-scale projects in new sectors. Some regions or countries around the world have begun to introduce legal and regulatory regimes to support CCS projects, and I'd highlight probably the Europe, Alberta, Victoria and Australia as being some of those with some of the more advanced legal and regulatory regimes to support CCS, but we know that we need more. We also know that the international climate discussions that are underway leading up to the Paris Conference of the Parties at the end of next year under the UNFCCC will provide the overarching framework to drive action on CCS. Without clear global goals and aims for us to take action on climate change, we're not going to have the incentives for us to undertake and make these significant investments. But I think the key thing to stress is that a global agreement is not sufficient to support CCS. Regional and national policies so that we can have more specific drivers for projects in each of the regions around the world. When we look at the policies that are in place, we know that there is significant support for renewable energy around the world. And you can see in the chart on your screen there that we have seen reflecting the policies that are providing incentives to renewable energies, significant investment in renewable energy in recent years. According to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, there's been almost $2 trillion investment in all clean energy over the period, but only 20 billion in CCS. We think that that partly reflects the fact that there is not the same policy support for CCS that we've seen for renewables. We're not asking for preferable or suggesting that there should be preferable treatment for CCS over other technologies. We're just saying that the policy parity is essential, that the technology policies that countries put in place should be neutral to ensure that the right technology is being deployed in the right areas where it's appropriate. So in this year's report, we've put together 5 key recommendations for decision makers. The first is that near-term policy support is critical to move those projects that are in the advanced stages of planning through to construction, to help them make that final investment decision so that we go from a project being a nice idea to being a reality. The second thing we need to see is strong, sustainable emissions reduction policies at the international and at the national level, that will give investors the confidence to invest in CCS. And crucially, these policies should be technology neutral. The third thing is stressing the importance of understanding and improving our understanding of storage resources. We need to have the certainty to make those investment decisions on where is the best places to store our CO2. And it takes time, so that's why we can't afford to wait. We need to be making the investments now to understand our storage resources. Our fourth point here is a little bit different, and I haven't actually touched on this in the presentation till now, but that's the importance of making sure that we continue to see progress in CCS outside the OECD countries. We already have seen significant action in China occurring, but beyond that, we don't see nearly as much progress as you would hope. Into the future, a significant proportion of global emissions will come from outside the OECD countries, and that's why CCS is critical to be deployed in those countries where we'll see emissions growth. So that's something that the Institute would like to work with partners in the near future, is to make sure that we're helping countries outside the OECD to be ready and take the action to deploy CCS where it's suitable and appropriate for them. The final recommendation that we have this year is about the industrial process sector. Around 20% of the world's global emissions come from industrial process emissions, such as those produced when you make iron and steel and cement. These are different from energy sector emissions. There is no option to switch to renewable energy or another large-scale technology to cut emissions from the production of these products. CCS is currently the only large-scale technological solution to stop emissions in the iron and steel and cement sectors. But as I flagged, we currently only have one large-scale project under construction or consideration in this sector, and that's the Abu Dhabi CCS steel project. So we think it's urgent that policy and attention be given now to incentivising the deployment of CCS in these sectors. So finally, our call to action for the year. We think it's time to build on the watershed year that is 2014, where we saw CCS in the power sector become a reality. We have 50% more projects than we did at the beginning of this decade, but we can't rest on our laurels. We need to make sure that we are making the decisions now that will drive the next generation of CCS projects. We need to take all the messages that have come out of this report and make sure we're promoting CCS, making sure that we understand what are the barriers to stopping its wide-scale deployment, making sure that decision makers and the general public understand and support the deployment of CCS. We know that the challenge is not technology. We know that we can capture CO2. We know that we can transport it, and we know then we can store CO2. But we need the policies in place, we need the public support, and we need the demonstration to bring down the costs so that we can build on our recent successes, ensure that we are deploying CCS globally at the scale that we need to contribute to action on climate change. So I'd encourage you all to jump on the Institute's website, have a look at the full report. As I said, it covers all aspects of CCS, so not just policy and legal and regulatory developments, but it all goes through the technological developments and the status of where CCS is at globally. So I encourage you to jump on our website, have a look at the full report, and please feel free to contact us at any time if you'd like further information. But now I think we will open up to questions, and I would welcome you to submit your questions in the question box on the screen in front of you. Please pop your questions in English, and we will do our best to get through as many questions we can in the time that we have remaining. So thanks so much for your attention. All right, so the first question that we have received is there an estimate of how much CO2 has been captured from coal-fired plants? So as I flagged in the presentation, we only have one CCS project operating at large scale in the coal-fired power sector at the moment, and that's the Boundary Dam project. There have been, of course, smaller pilot scale and demonstration projects around the world, but Boundary Dam is the world's first large scale project in the power sector. It only commenced operation in September, so obviously it's still in its early days of operation. But the reports from Sask Power, who are the operator, are that the project is already capturing over 90% of the CO2 at a high level of purity, and they estimate that they'll be capturing around 1 million tonnes of CO2 each year. So I think, you know, that's a significant contribution to, you know, capturing emissions from that plant alone. Our second question, which I'm actually going to throw over to Chris Consoli, who's our storage expert, is what is the total storage of all the CCS projects currently operating around the world? So Chris, could you help us out there?
Yes, thank you, Claire. If all the 22 projects were capturing and storing their CO2, it come to around 40 million tonnes per annum. Now, that's the equivalent of Denmark or Switzerland's emissions. But more importantly, if all 55 projects recognised by the Global Institute became commercial reality and stored the CO2, it'd be over 100 million tonnes per annum. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks for that, Chris. All right. Our next question, actually for Chris again, is about enhanced oil recovery. And the question is, so why are projects that use captured CO2 for enhanced oil recovery considered CCS?
So enhanced oil recovery projects are really important for CCS projects for three main reasons. Firstly, they provide first-of-a-kind projects like Boundary Dam or Kemper County the commercial reality through selling CO2 that are really needed for these new CCS projects. Secondly, they provide technical innovation through learning by doing. That is what you need to do with new projects, especially in the areas of monitoring the CO2 plume. And finally, they provide the expertise of the people who are capturing, transporting and storing the CO2 in these projects to the wider community to show that CCS is a reality. And that can only be done through enhanced oil recovery.
Great. And it's true, isn't it, Chris, that enhanced oil recovery isn't an option for all regions around the world?
No, the properties of the oil have to be very specific, and the properties of the CO2 have to be very specific as well. So they do not work in every oil field, and they do not work for every capture technique. But across each oil producing area, there are options for enhanced oil recovery available. Some areas are more likely to get a better outcome from the enhanced oil recovery through using CO2 and others less so.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Chris. My next question is actually for Tony Zhang, who's our capture technology expert here in the Asia Pacific team. So Tony, the question we have here is, what is the energy penalty that's currently being used in the state-of-the-art carbon capture projects at the coal-fired power station? And I assume by this the question is referring to Boundary Dam.
Right. Thanks, Claire. As Claire mentioned earlier, the Boundary Dam project has now started operation, and so the project has reported a heat requirement to regenerate CO2 at around 2.5 gigajoules per ton CO2, and the capture plant requires around 20 to 21% parasitic energy to operate. So we are very excited to see these numbers, and they are the best numbers so far at a large scale. And so these numbers, again, prove that continued demonstration projects and more R&D are much needed to further reduce carbon capture costs.
Great, thanks for that, Tony. Our next question is moving away from technology over to the more policy side of things, in particular looking at the international aspects. And the question here is, what are the priorities that the Institute would like to see on the UNFCCC agenda? And what outcomes would it like to see coming out of the deal in Paris in 2015? So as many of you are aware, obviously the UNFCCC is working towards the potential for a new global agreement for acting on climate change for post-2020 at the Paris meeting, which will occur at the end of 2015. Before we get there, obviously, we've got to go to Lima at the end of this year, where I think there'll be a lot of the preparatory discussions that will lead to the Paris meeting. I think there are three things that the Institute would be keen to see that emerge out of the international discussions and potentially eventually a new agreement. The first one is obviously clear, unambiguous commitments to global emissions reductions. I think that we all know that the incentives and momentums to support deployment of CCS at a large scale require clear, unambiguous messages from the global leaders that we need to be acting on climate change and cutting our global emissions. We don't have a view, I don't think, on the form that those emissions reductions should take, but for us it's about clear, unambiguous goals being set. Secondly, we would hope that the international agreements and discussions recognise the critical role of CCS as part of a full portfolio of technologies. So we want to make sure that CCS is recognised alongside energy efficiency and renewable energy, and those other technological solutions are there. It's important for us that CCS is given parity with those other technologies, because we think that will ensure that where it's appropriate and where there is an advantage for it being deployed, it will have the best chance of being deployed. I think the third thing is, I would say about any international agreement is, while it's important, we don't think it's the only thing that is necessary to support the deployment of CCS. It will be critical that whatever is achieved or included in a new international agreement is that it's translated through to national and regional policies and programs, because that is where we will see the on-the-ground practical drivers for deployment of CCS. Obviously, it's possible that mechanisms such as the climate technology networks can also contribute to driving CCS projects, and hopefully that's where, as I flagged, we'll be seen equally with other low emissions technologies. I think we, along with others, will be watching closely the developments that occur, and the Institute is an accredited observer to the UNFCCC, so we'll be at the Lima conferences and the Paris conferences, actively participating and being a clear, strong voice for CCS. All right, our next question is of a legal nature, so I'm going to ask Ian Havercroft to address this for us. So Ian, the Global Status report highlights that we had varying responses from CCS projects in the APAC region on the status of legal and regulatory regimes. Could you please comment on the contrast, particularly the variation between projects in Asia versus the rest of the world on the status of legal regimes to support CCS?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Claire. What we have seen with regard to progress in APAC in particular, in our perception survey this year, where we asked projects to make an appraisal of a number of key legal and regulatory principles in their individual jurisdictions, we started to see that there's an increased number of issues within those particular regions identified as addressed or partially addressed in the view of the individual project. This is, very positive, and particularly for a country like Australia, indicative perhaps that the legal and regulatory regime really is fit for purpose and complete. When we analysed some of the responses from some of our projects in the Asia region specifically, we did notice that there was a significant variation in the responses, and this is perhaps because of the nascency of law and regulation in a number of countries in this region, particularly when we consider non-EOR operations and full carbon capture and storage operations, where legal and regulatory regimes have been designed in a similar fashion in Australia or Europe or the US. So that's that's the main reason why we're seeing these significant variations. It really just highlights the fact that there is a real urgency to develop comprehensive legal and regulatory regimes in some of the countries here in Asia, and to sort of move them on into that category of second generation regulators that we previously described in our status report.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Ian. Our next question is actually moving on to a different topic, which is that of public engagement. We all know that in infrastructure and resource projects around the world, public understanding and acceptance can play a really critical role. So the question that we have, which I'm going to throw to Jessica Morton, is what are some of the key recommendations for CCS public engagement in 2015?
Thank you, Claire. We've been very fortunate that existing CCS projects, those that are moving forward and those that have ceased for various reasons, have been generous in sharing the lessons that they've learnt out of their public engagement strategies, as well as assisting in social scientists and researchers around the world to develop some best practice that we can all learn from. What we need to see here is improving the access that up-and-coming CCS projects have to those lessons. So that's the first recommendation emerging out of this year's status report. The second one is, this has been a request that's come from the CCS community on many different occasions, is that we need to improve the way that the CCS community engages with sectors that are outside of the community. And that's something that the Institute is looking at doing moving forward, as well as a number of other organisations. And the third recommendation is that we need to look at showcasing publicly those internationally significant projects, such as Boundary Dam, and what that means for CCS projects moving forward.
Great, thanks for that answer, Jess. All right, our next question relates to the cost of CCS, and I think this is one that we get a lot of questions about on a regular basis. And it's actually a little bit related, I think, partly to the answer that Tony gave when asked about the energy penalty and the status of capture technologies. We know that most studies out there see that CCS sits at around the middle of the pack when you look across the full spectrum of emissions reduction technologies that are available. But we know that costs will obviously vary on a project-by-project basis, depending on the individual characteristics of a project, be that which sector it's operating in, its distance from its storage site, the characteristics of the storage site, and the technologies chosen. So costs will vary on a case-by-case case-by-case basis. We do expect now, with the operation of the Boundary Dam project, that we will see emerging some figures on actual real large-scale application of CCS technologies in the power sector, and we hope that this will help to inform at a greater level of detail the costs that can be the costs of deploying CCS in that sector. I think the interesting thing about the Boundary Dam project is that we already have feedback from Sask Power that based on the lessons they've learnt in the deployment of this and development of this first project, that they anticipate that the cost reductions for their next project could be as high as 25 or 30% lower than what they were for the first project at Boundary Dam. So I think that just demonstrates that continued deployment of CCS, of this first-of-a-kind technology, will be essential for reducing costs. Our next question is on emissions performance standards for power stations. The United States and United Kingdom have both introduced or are considering emissions performance standards for power stations. Do you think this is an effective effective policy for the deployment of CCS? It's true, the United Kingdom, under its new Energy Act, has implemented a requirement that new coal-fired power stations be CCS ready, and that this policy sits along other mechanisms, including the Contract for Difference, as well as the UK's £1 billion competition for CCS. I think that the Institute's view would be that this portfolio of policies and programs and support, which combines regulation with financial incentives and financial upfront capital support, is what is helping these new first-of-a-kind projects progress. Obviously, the mix of policies will vary depending on the location, the sector, and the conditions for each project, but our view is that a portfolio approach is required. These are still first-of-a-kind projects in many cases, so upfront capital support and incentives is important, as is ongoing operational support. And of course, regulation can play a role in certain places as well. So I think that from our perspective, what we'd like to see is a portfolio of policies to support CCS, and importantly, that it's getting policy parity with the other low emissions technologies that are out there. All right, and our final question that we have time for today is, why is the US leading the world with the most CCS projects? As I pointed out, 26 of the 55 large-scale projects that are under consideration or under construction operating around the world are in the US. I think that you could say that this reflects a number of factors. First, the fact that firms in North America, both Canada and the United States, are able to earn revenue at the moment from capturing CO2 and using it for enhanced oil recovery is a key economic driver. I think secondly, the significant capital funding and support that's provided by the United States government is also playing a key role in supporting deployment of CCS. And I think that it's a combination of these factors which is seeing the deployment of CCS in the highest numbers in the North America region. On that note, unfortunately we're going to have to wrap things up there, but I'd like to thank our expert panel for assisting with answering the questions today. I'd also encourage you to please get in contact if you have any questions. There's an email address on your screen at the moment, which is webinar@globalccsinstitute.com. Send through any additional questions that you have or any queries, and we'd be very happy to get back to you. So again, thank you for your time today, and good afternoon.